is the best plain talker on climate that I know, our mandate was very clear. In the Secretary General's words, we urgently need every business, investor, city, state, and region to walk the talk on their net zero promises. We cannot afford any slow movers, fake movers, or any form of greenwashing. Well, Secretary General, I'm very proud to announce that our expert group has delivered. I want to give huge credit to our incredible expert group, many of who are here, and I see we have Malengo and Camilla joining us virtually. They really are extraordinary. Over 7 months, a group that comprises more women than men, that represents regions from around the world and a huge diversity of perspectives, and with an incredible range of expertise. From a scientist to a CEO, environmentalist to civil society head, former head of state, former regulators, and just generally awesome people, and of course, a recovering politician like me. You're fortunate to hear from a number of them later. And this was done in mock speed, guys. Just 7 months, we arrived at a consensus report. It's called Integrity Matters, and it's being released right now, so check your phones. I want to express the expert group's sincere appreciation to the hundreds of groups and thousands of individuals who participated in our consultations and made submissions. Your ideas and concerns factored greatly into our deliberations. I certainly hope our work can be a springboard for your continued efforts to achieve net zero and hold folks accountable. I don't have to tell you that we're in a critical moment for the planet. Here in Africa, there's extreme drought, which threatens millions of people. I could go through what's happening and what we've seen around the world. We need to act now, and we need to act more ambitiously, and we're all on the hook. But it's also a make or break moment for net zero pledges by non-state actors. Who are they? They're businesses, they're financial institutions, they're cities and regions. Either net zero helps drive the ambition we need right now so that we stay below 1.5 degrees, or by focusing on 2050, it results in delay, obfuscation, and yes, greenwashing. So first, the good news. According to a recent report, over 80% of global emissions are covered by net zero pledges. And I want to give a huge shout out to the first movers, many of whom are in this room. Cities and regions that are reducing their emissions by transforming their grid with renewables and moving to district heating, building new public transit and cycling paths, retrofitting their buildings. Companies that are future-proofing themselves, investing in innovation and driving down emissions while supporting the businesses, often very small businesses, through their supply chain to do the same. Investors that are moving their investments from dirty to clean and investing in companies around the world that are building a cleaner future. But now the bad news. Too many of these net zero pledges represent little more than empty slogans and hype. And consumers are right to be skeptical. Just a few days ago, an Edelman report on trust and climate change, which surveyed 14,000 people and covered 14 countries, confirmed that business lags badly when it comes to green credentials. Nearly 2/3 of respondents believe companies are mediocre at, or worse at delivering their climate commitments, and fewer than half of people trust CEOs to tell the truth about climate change. Why is greenwashing so bad? In part, it's because the stakes are so high. It's not just false advertising. Bogus net zero claims drive up the cost that ultimately everyone will pay. including people who will pay the most, who are not in these rooms. They will pay that through huge impacts, through climate migration, and with their very lives. Greenwashing also fuels public cynicism about climate issues and undermines one of the few mechanisms that we have to coordinate global action. And most of all, it threatens us ever reaching the goals that we have all agreed to in this room. The goals set out in the Paris Agreement, the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and the promises that we all make to our kids and grandkids to ensure a sustainable future for them. And I say that with my daughter, who is somewhere in this room, who reminds me every day, did you actually do anything on climate change? Most days I say I had meetings. All right, so let's give some highlights about the report and talk about why I think they're important. First, if you're a non-state actor, what must you do? And these shouldn't come as a surprise, folks. If you're going to commit to something, you have to do the work. You must have short and medium-term targets, 25, 2030, 2035, aligned with the science of 1.5 degrees with low to no overshoot. You must show the work. You must have a detailed transition plan focused on immediate emission reductions across your value chain and capital expenditures aligned with these targets and the net zero pathway. You must report publicly and transparently on progress with verified information that can be compared with peers. But second, we set very clear red lines in greenwashing. This is what you cannot do. If you announce publicly, you put up your hand and you say, I'm a climate leader, I'm committed to net zero. You cannot claim to be net zero while continuing to build or invest in new fossil fuel supply. This isn't just our expert group saying that. This is based on the science and the International Energy Agency reports. Similarly, deforestation is disqualifying. You can't buy cheap credits that very often lack integrity and often hurt local communities and indigenous peoples rather than prioritizing cutting emissions across your value chain. A number of members emphasize that high integrity credits, something that a number of initiatives are crucially working on, can have a role to play, but in addition to the hard work that you must do to decarbonize. And that funding can be used to support decarbonization efforts in developing countries. You can't simply reduce the intensity of your emissions. You need to reduce absolute emissions. And you need to tackle all of your emissions across your value chain. That includes reducing Scope 3 emissions, which for some non-state actors is 95% of emissions. And you cannot say you're a climate leader and lobby, including through trade associations, against climate action. But of course, we need folks to be accountable. How can we ensure accountability? One, if you're committed to net zero, you need to meaningfully link incentives at the highest level, including executive compensation in a meaningful way to progress on a climate plan. Voluntary standard setters need to hold their members accountable. If your members do not comply with criteria and standards, including what we're setting out, there need to be consequences, including potentially removal. And we need way more transparency. And I want to give a shout out to a great initiative to create a net zero data public utility. This is an initiative spearheaded by President Macron and Mike Bloomberg in very close cooperation with the United Nations and its Global Climate Action Portal. Welcome, Simon, and get to work. as well as many others. And I want to give a special shout out to Mary Shapiro, who chairs this great initiative and runs GFANS. We need to create a public, open data climate portal that will provide transparent, comparable data that is verified so that companies can be held accountable for net zero pledges. But let's be honest, there is a limit to voluntary pledges. To effectively ensure a level playing field and ensure that everyone is part of the net zero party, and to tackle greenwashing, we make a call for governments to regulate net zero commitments, starting with large emitters. But there's something else that's really important in this report, and it's a huge credit to the amazing members. This report also emphasizes the importance of just transitions. That the global transition to net zero is not going to happen if we're leaving countries and people behind. We need a new deal for developing countries that ensures a just transition for all and brings the scale of the resources required to achieve it. In part, this requires financial institutions and multinational corporations to work with governments and multinational development finance institutions to innovate, and let's be frank, take on more risk, as well as to set more ambitious targets that help to maximize their investment in clean energy and climate resilience in less developed countries. All right, so is all of this possible? Yes. Much of what we recommend is really about common sense and leveling up the playing field so that net zero pledges, on which so much our future depends, have integrity. And I've watched this change before. As Canada's former Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and hello to Stephen Guilbeault, the new minister, good luck, as well as Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, I saw the power of businesses, financial institutions, cities and regions to help enable and accelerate positive change by supporting our government to put a revenue-neutral price on carbon pollution across the country. Precedent, advocacy, and leadership created an ambition loop that became even more powerful when governments and non-state actors worked together. Today, we need an ambition loop for net zero, one that accelerates the pace of global change. We believe that our report, worked so hard and diligently on over 7 months, and the recommendations can help propel our global ambitions for real and essential, ambitious and immediate climate action, and yes, put a red line around greenwashing. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We are now honored to hear from the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Secretary General, take the floor.
Dear Catherine McKenna, you have just given us a lesson based on the hard work and very effective work of the panel, a very comprehensive description of the content and the recommendations of the panel. Now it's my time to show if I have learned the lesson or not. And I will, of course, wait for your judgment to see if I can move forward in relation to the very important work that you have done. And I want to start by thanking you and thanking the panel for this extraordinary contribution for climate action. Last year, at COP26, I announced that I would establish a high-level expert group to address net zero commitments by non-state actors, particularly businesses, financial institutions, cities, and regions. And I have to say that this announcement came immediately after a meeting I had with the representatives of the civil society that made that suggestion And I found that suggestion a very important one and decided to move forward with it, which demonstrates how important is the role of civil society in helping decision makers to make the right choices. It was clear that we had a big gap in the climate space. A growing number of governments and non-state actors are pledging to be carbon-free, and obviously that's good news. The problem is that the criteria and benchmarks for these net zero commitments have varying levels of rigor and loopholes wide enough to drive a diesel truck through. We must have zero tolerance for net zero greenwashing. Net zero pledges, today's expert group report is on how to guide to ensure credible, accountable net zero pledges. It provides clarity in 4 key areas: environmental integrity, credibility, accountability, and the role of governments. I will briefly touch on each. First, on environmental integrity, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is our scientific North Star. Net zero pledges must be in line with IPCC scenarios limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. That means global emissions must decline by at least 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Pledges should have interim targets every 5 years starting in 2025, and these targets must cover all greenhouse gas emissions and all scopes of emissions. For financial institutions, this means all financed activities. For businesses, it means all emissions, direct, indirect, and those originating from supply chains. And for cities and regions, it means all territorial emissions. The message is clear to all those managing existing voluntary initiatives, as well as CEOs, mayors, governors committing to net zero. Abide by this standard and update your guidelines right away, and certainly no later than COP28. I also have a message to fossil fuel companies and their financial enablers. So-called net zero pledges that exclude core products and activities are poisoning our planet. They must thoroughly review their pledges and align them with this new guidance. And let's tell it like it is. Using bogus net zero pledges to cover up massive fossil fuel expansion is reprehensible. It is rank deception. This toxic cover-up could push our world over the climate cliff. The sham must end. Second, on credibility, full and rapid decarbonization this decade is the ultimate test. Leaders from businesses, financial institutions, and local authorities need to present transition plans with their net zero pledges. And these plans should be publicly available with detailed, concrete actions to meet all targets. Management must be accountable for delivering on these pledges. And this means publicly advocating for decisive climate action and disclosing all lobbying activity. The absence of standards, regulations, and rigor in voluntary carbon market credits is deeply concerning. Shadow markets for carbon credits cannot undermine genuine emission reduction efforts, including in the short term. Targets must be reached through real emissions cuts. Fossil fuels must be phased out and renewable energy scaled up. I thank the group for providing clarity and details on what businesses, financial institutions, and subnational authorities need to do to phase out coal, oil, and gas. As fossil fuel finance is scaled down, climate finance for renewable energy needs to be scaled up. Private financial institutions must now fully facilitate investments for a renewable energy revolution and proactively work with international financial institutions to address issues of cost of capital and risk perceptions. Namely, the cost of capital in the developing world is something that worries us a lot. Let's not forget that renewable energy have a concentration of costs in the capital cost. And so, to keep high interest rates in developing countries for these projects might kill them, and we need to make sure that the international financial system responds to this question. And at the same time, the transition to net zero must be just. Transition plans should address the needs of workers in fossil fuel industries and sectors affected by the renewable energy transition. By the first half of 2023, all existing net zero voluntary initiatives must explain how they will align and revise their standards accordingly. And all new initiatives must abide by these recommendations. My climate action team stands ready to assist in this process. I also ask UN agencies working on developing, implementing, or in any way supporting voluntary pledges to abide by these standards and criteria. Third, on accountability, full transparency is critical. The UNFCCC has a global and public platform, the Global Climate Action Portal, that is already being used to register pledges, publish transition plans, and track annual reporting on implementation. But it needs to be scaled up. I call on all net zero voluntary initiatives to accelerate efforts to standardize progress reports in an open format and via public platforms that feed into the UNFCCC portal. Government or private sector commitments to net zero cannot be a mere public relations exercise. We must work together to fill gaps from the lack of universally recognized credible third-party authorities, and we must strengthen mechanisms positioned to conduct this verification and accountability process. It is my deep belief that UNFCCC should play a decisive role, and I invite its Executive Secretary to present a plan early next year. Fourth and finally, governments need to ensure that these voluntary initiatives become the new normal. I urge all government leaders to provide non-state entities with a level playing field to transition to a just net zero future. Solving the climate crisis requires strong political leadership. The G20, together with all OECD countries, must accelerate the decarbonization of their economies and then their addiction and subsidies to fossil fuels. This means they must rapidly regulate, design policies, pass legislation, and approve budgets to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And I call on all other governments to build a net zero regulatory environment to fit their needs and national circumstances. I will closely follow the proposed task force on net zero regulations. I ask that its leadership and membership are as diverse and representative as this high-level group. Once again, I thank the group for their vital contributions, and you can count on us, and on me in particular, to help move to the net zero future we need, and I thank you.
Secretary General, thank you warmly for your leadership, your vision, and setting the way forward. Before we move to hearing from the high-level experts themselves, I will welcome to the floor Mahmoud Mohaldin, who is the high-level champion of COP27. The floor is yours.
Secretary General, Minister McKenna, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important report, and there are very few reports that we can really describe them as having a before and after. So after the very strong words of the Secretary General and the excellent explanation of the outcomes of this report by Minister McKenna, I'd like to thank her and the excellent team that worked closely with her in order to provide us a robust, credible, and inclusive net zero standard. Thank you. On behalf of the Climate Champions team and their work, which I represent today. When it comes to implementation, we need to see ready candidates to comply with the new rules of engagement, to avoid greenwashing, and I'm happy to listen to the Secretary General mentioning as well the issue of the cost of capital, because developing economies and emerging markets suffer not just from greenwashing as their brothers in the advanced economies, but they suffer as well from green exclusion. Some of these instruments claim that they are green, are hard to get because of their cost. So I'm happy that the issue of affordability could be considered and an inclusive approach is being maintained. This report needs to be operationalized, it needs to be taken seriously by regulatory agencies, and it needs to be embraced by the standard setters. For ourselves, as representatives of the Race to Zero campaign, this is the largest alliance rallying non-state actors to take rigorous and immediate action to halve global emissions by 2030. This is a target that we know from the IPCC report is very hard to achieve, especially that we are deviating from these targets for reasons that we all know from this report and other reports based on science and evidence. Currently, the Race to Zero is 11,000 plus non-state actors from across 116 countries, more than 8,300 businesses, more than 1,100 cities, 52 regions, 595 financial institutions, 1,125 educational institutions, and 65 healthcare institutions. I cited the numbers from my colleagues as exact, not by approximation, because everyone counts here when it comes to compliance. We will do what we can, and we have the tools relying on disclosure mechanisms and the standards, working closely as partners to more transparency for tracking the progress to ensure clear transition plans and to accelerate systems change across the economies. Another aspect of the recommendation that we appreciate, I'd like to explicitly recognize that the needed aligned corporate lobbying with climate targets are fully recognized in the Race to Zero updated criteria. So we are in full alignment with this report, and I'm happy to see all of the membership, including the members of the GFANs and the Africa chapter as well of the GFANs, which was just newly born, are adhering to these rules based on the good engagement that we have. Having said that, this is a COP of implementation. We appreciate the work because it's implementable, but this needs political leadership, and this definitely needs good transparency and disclosure mechanisms, but we're fully behind you in that and with you in the implementation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now it's time to give the floor to some of the eminent HageLeg members. So now let's hear from Arunabha Ghosh, Bill Hare, Helena Vignes, and Mary Nichols, all here in person. Please take the stage together with Catherine. And I also want to announce that we have Malango Mugongo on virtual participation, and she will also be part of the panel.
Well, thanks. And first of all, I want to thank the Secretary General, because I wasn't exactly sure what he was going to say. But good news, good news. It looks like you supported our report and you made calls to action that are consistent with it, and you have such a powerful voice. And you are always very clear about the need for more ambition, and I just really want to thank you for giving me the honor of being chair, but also I know on behalf of all of our members, your very clear mandate and your leadership in this area. All right, so some of our panelists, I wish we could have everyone, but then this event might go till midnight, and so I know you have some other things to do. So I'll start with Bill. I don't want to typecast people, but he's kind of our scientist. You're okay with that? Oh, good news. So look, I mean, what is critically important is that net zero commitments obviously have to start with credible pledges that are firmly rooted in the science. Discuss.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Secretary General, for launching the process. It's been an honour to work on it. Well, Catherine, I think the first and most important thing that we all know is that getting to net zero is about limiting warming to the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit. We know, but if we achieve that, we'll still have very serious climate impacts. At 1.1 degrees now, we're seeing really catastrophic floods in Pakistan, wildfires raging across Siberia, the US, tides and floods affecting small island states, and so on. So to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we have to get to net zero. But to achieve that, the world has to first make deep cuts, at least 50% by 2030. Without those deep cuts, we will not get to net zero by 2050. We won't be able to bend the curves on the emissions fast enough. But net zero doesn't mean, as Catherine said, offsetting emissions and carrying on business as usual. We know this is unsustainable. So offsets should really be reserved for the most difficult to abate sectors. And I guess this is why the first of our 5 key principles in the report is for ambition which delivers significant near and medium-term emission reductions on a path to global net zero by 2050. Now, our recommendations, looking at the science point of view, focus on ensuring our net zero pledges are credible and aligned with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. In our report, we have a number of recommendations. I can't go through all of them, but some of the key elements of those for net zero goals is that to have science-aligned net zero goals is first, there needs to be alignment with the IPCC, or International Energy Agency, net zero pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We need to have stepping stone targets every 5 years, set out concrete ways of getting there. Now, we also looked at some other elements of this. We thought about how offset should be used, and as Catherine's already said, we found that offset shouldn't be used for non-state actors' own 1.5 degree aligned targets. We found that high integrity carbon offset credits could be used and only used for value chain mitigation beyond those targets, but not counted towards the interim emission reductions. We also looked at what needs to be done to phase out fossil fuels and scale up renewable energy for business, financial institutions, cities and regions. We're recommending that all net zero pledges should include specific targets aimed at ending the use of and/or support for fossil fuels in line with the IPCC and IEA net zero pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We made a number of recommendations for business, including setting end dates for coal, ending new oil and gas developments, but on the solution side, scaling up renewable energy procurement. For financial institutions, we also had important recommendations that relate to the phasing out of fossil fuels. You'll find them in the reports, I won't go through that. But we did emphasize the need for financial institutions to have end dates for investments for coal in the power sector, for gas. And on the solution side, we also recommended strongly that financial institutions include and emphasize developing clean solutions. That is, they focus on developing and creating investment products that facilitate and are aligned with net zero emissions and facilitate increased investment in renewable energy, particularly in developing countries.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's good we have these members who are very, very smart, much smarter than me, who can really make sure that we're rooting everything in science. So now we're going to jump to a longtime friend of mine, Mary Nichols, and a former regulator, and someone who's dealt a lot with businesses. So can you talk a bit about how credible net zero pledges have to have a plan that aligns with business operations?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, this is on. It has been a tremendous honor and opportunity to work with this group of people who come from different parts of the globe and different perspectives. But I think we all came to the conclusion that moving towards regulation, at least to the extent that a voluntary pledge has to be in some way subject to the openness and transparency that you get under a regulatory scheme, and has to be aimed at a goal, which is, as you said, Bill, science-based. There has to be a number that you're aiming towards. Otherwise, it's a percentage of something unknown and unknowable. And so the march forward, and it is a march, we know we're in a transition. We know that things will change, opportunities will come along, technologies will improve, thank heavens, because they must. But they won't improve unless we keep setting firm targets and then we keep implementing them. And the only way we can implement them successfully is through publicly available forms of disclosure of what those who are making these pledges actually are doing. So we called for the regular accounting. We've called for alignment of companies' actions, all of their actions, including executive compensation, with the net zero pledge. And we have said, in addition to that, and I don't want this to slide off because I'm not sure it's been mentioned yet, that including consideration of the just transition in the plan is critical to making it viable. And I want to emphasize that point based on my experience with running a program that actually had a cap in California, is that without having directed the revenues and the attention from that program in the direction of improving communities and lives of people in communities who have been subject to unjust environmental assault in the past, as well as thinking about the economic well-being of those communities and of workers, the public in general, you can't have a pledge that will actually work. What you end up with is a pledge that perhaps simply drives to a lowest common denominator, which by definition means that you're not going to get high-level, credible action in pursuit of the plan. So we're about credibility, and I think that the report is quite clear in making specific recommendations about how that can happen.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. So now we're going to go to the screen. Malango Mogogov, I think maybe coming to us from South Africa, but who's a climate expert, but also someone who always emphasized justice and equity in everything we did. It's great if you could talk about the importance of considering just transition in net zero plans, including in assessing impacts, consultations on efforts to address them, and making sure small and medium-sized enterprises in supply chains are supported.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine, and also to my colleagues on the group, and of course to the Secretary General for his leadership and vision. Yes, the just transition comes from one of the key principles that guided our recommendation, and that is that non-state actors show demonstrable commitment to both equity and justice in all actions. And this principle of equity and justice should be familiar to us because it's enshrined in other principles in the UNFCCC, such as common but differential responsibility, and in the Paris Agreement related to just transition, as you've mentioned. So this is very familiar ground. However, in the context of non-state actors and net zero, it's not familiar ground. And as we know, with the steep and rapid emission reductions that we need from non-state actors, will require a fundamental shift in the way we live. And that shift brings massive opportunities for technological advancement, for human advancement, but it also brings massive risks, particularly to the most vulnerable people, communities, countries, and indeed the ecosystems on which we depend. So for example, you mentioned that deforestation in our recommendations is one of the key things that non-state actors cannot do. So science tells us, IPCC has told us that deforestation driven by land use change and agriculture contributes about 11% of per annum of global greenhouse gas emissions, and this, of course, reduces the ability of the forests as carbon sinks. So we know that, for example, we have to end deforestation by 2025. Here in South Africa, where I am based, for example, coal sector workers are already talking about ghost towns, which have been created because of decreased coal mining activities and electricity generation from coal as well. So the transition is happening, and for example, at a global level, the importance of micro and small and medium enterprises cannot be underemphasized. They, according to the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, for example, they estimate that they make up about 90% of businesses, which is significant, and provide almost or over 50% of employment. So they're incredibly important to our global economy. And I think you mentioned, Catherine, that they also supply often important legs in the supply chain to the larger companies that will deliver the emissions that we need. But they face the real risk of being excluded from these value chains and supply chains if they themselves don't have the financing or the technical ability and skills to be able to reduce their own emissions. That's a real risk. And also linked to that, finally, one of the other big risks we know we need to avoid is indigenous peoples are custodians of our land and knowledge, in fact, that is essential for our survival, and yet they're often not included in conversations about net zero. So that's why a key part of our recommendations, and the just transition is intertwined in several different recommendations, but broadly we're saying that the just transition aspects have to be embedded into transition plans. It's a no-brainer, as Mary mentioned, but it's also an important requirement from a justice and equity perspective. And actually, you may think that or non-state actors may think this is really challenging. It's complex, and yes, it is. But by definition, it's not a journey that we're expecting non-state actors to walk alone. They need to engage with their stakeholders, with the affected communities, to be able to deliver this. So this is not something they're expected to deliver alone in their plans. It needs to, be as a result of significant engagement. And interestingly, just as a last comment, the editor of the Banker magazine recently stated in a blog post about reaching the 1.5-degree climate target that the banking sector clients of a large advisory firm, and now I quote, are working on tools to help their SME customers understand their footprint and help them to take action, trying to act as more of a partner and less of a policeman. And I think that says it all. In other words, it's possible to do this. And it tells me that where there's a will, there's a way. So yeah, I feel very excited about these recommendations because I think they provide really, really clear guidance to non-state actors about what needs to be done in terms of addressing their emissions whilst ensuring that the transition is as just and equitable as possible. Thanks.
Thank you. Whoops. Thank you very much, Malango. And I see Joachim's joined us as well. Thank you, Joachim. So now I'm going to turn back to Helena, Helena Vinas Fiestas, who is a regulatory expert. I think that's fair. Could you talk a bit about the importance of transparency to hold people account, why it is challenging, the issue of competitiveness, and very briefly, in high-level terms, what we're proposing and why you think it is achievable?
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon to everyone. In the last few years, we've seen a plethora of net zero pledges made by non-state actors, which is really commendable and an important step forward. Unfortunately, though, the time is so pressing that it's not enough. We're facing two main challenges. The first one is that only 1/3 of the world's largest publicly traded businesses have committed to net zero. That leaves 2/3 out. Further, the vast majority of privately listed and state-owned enterprises have not committed. Secondly, of those who have committed, only half of them are part of a voluntary initiative, and even fewer are actually translating pledges into action. We're facing a deficit of quality on the pledges. They lack depth and detail. There is little accountability, to be honest. Few of the non-state actors inform on the progress they're making. And when they don't do it in a standardized manner. So it's very difficult to compare, the progress between non-state actors, and sometimes even to assess individual progress. And this is why we are recommending non-state actors to be transparent about the pledges and about their plans. Not only to publish their targets, but also how they plan to achieve them. How exactly are they planning to reach their targets? And basically, that's all the details that Mary talked about. It is so important that there is consistency, and consistency means between the governance, capital expenditures, between the incentive structures, the research and development, and the business strategy. What we're asking non-state actors is to publish on their report, to publish on their progress, to publish annually the greenhouse gases, and to report also the reduction made on those emissions. Now, when it comes to the largest financial and non-financial companies, we think that they should get their disclosures assured and their greenhouse gases reporting verified. One of the recurrent themes in our consultations was this need for a global, central digital repository, such as the Global Data Utility. One repository that encompasses all reporting data points, and that is open source, access to all users, and that enables non-state actors to upload their information at no extra cost. The repository should ensure the quality of the data, should be overseen by the UNFCCC, and should feed into the Global Climate Action Portal. So if I sum up, we need to enhance the quality of the pledges and the plan, and we need to persuade the rest of non-state actors to join the club. And this is why, and when you think about it, such a process will take quite a bit of time. Realistically, there is no time to do that in a voluntary basis. And this is why we are asking, and we think that it's time for countries to start regulating net zero. It is to translate pledges into action, but it's also to ensure consistency, competitiveness, and the level playing field. Sometimes we forget how new, in a way, the world of net zero. It's also for policymakers, regulators, and supervisors across the world, and how net zero touches upon so many regulatory domains. And this is why we believe that more than ever, policymakers need to connect across borders and across regulatory domains. And that's why we are proposing a new task force on net zero regulation to convene a community of international regulators to complement voluntary climate action with a set of clear rules to work together towards net zero.
Well, thank you very much, Helena. And now, last but not least, we have Aranaba Ghosh. And Aranaba, so how would I describe you? I guess you're an expert on climate, but you're in particular very focused on financial flows. How do we get the money going at scale? So maybe you can talk about, I think probably the audience understands, but in case they don't, why it's so important, but what we actually need to do to get the money flowing to scale and clean in developing countries. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Catherine, I want to thank you for your leadership of the group. It's been intense work over 7 months. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your inspiration and driving us, giving us that short timeline so that we don't twiddle our thumbs. Now, the first message I want to give is that there should be not a call for a just transition, there should be a call for not an unjust transition. All transitions have to be just by definition. It is to avoid the unjustness that we have to act. Now, why are we in a situation where we are in an unjust transition? It's because money does not flow to where the sun shines the most. If we want to act on climate, we've got to have the projects coming up where clean energy infrastructure is not only needed, but also where it delivers the most returns, where sun shines the most. And that is in the tropics, in the global south. Not flowing because the same regions are considered as risky areas for investment. So on one hand, we say that we have a big problem of climate risk, but on the other hand, we say we will not act on climate risk because the very regions that need that sustainable infrastructure are not getting the investment. And therefore, in the report, we call for a new deal for development for the global south, wherein the move towards net zero is consistent with the move towards increased flow of low-cost capital going to the global south. Today, the tariffs for renewable energy could be anywhere upwards, the share of the cost of capital could be anywhere upwards of 70, 80% of the tariff. We will not be able to drive down the cost, increase energy access for the 700 million plus people who still don't have access to electricity, and build sustainable infrastructure, and be within a carbon constraint, and call it a just transition. And therefore, what needs to happen? Number one, we ask for the non-state actors to work with the state actors, the governments, but also to work with the multilateral development banks, to look actively for projects in developing countries that can be invested. If you're a banker, rather than wait for people to come and ask for money, look for those projects. Number two, work on creating the de-risking initiatives at scale that drive much larger volumes of investment at much lower costs of capital. We need to leverage public finance to crowd in multiples more of private finance. And number three, set a high ambition for what it means to be the scale of climate investment. We need trillions to flow to the billions who live in the global south. And finally, for the non-state actors that are cities and regions, to look at your regulatory architecture that makes your regions far more attractive towards crowding in the public and the private investment at lower cost. So let's call for no unjust transition, because all transitions must be just. Thank you.
That's a very, very good way of putting it. But also, I think you can see the incredible members of this expert group. So the members that are here in the audience, I see Janine over there, Gunter, I see Jessica, I see Carlos, Amanda, Kahori, Camilla, Joachim, Mr. Zhao, who I don't know is tuning in from China, as well as Umar. I think I've got everyone. We did spend a lot of time together, at least virtually, but I just want to thank you. You put a lot of time and effort over 7 months, and it wasn't easy. I don't know if I'm handing this back to you, Haiti, or should I just close? Oh, okay. No, never do that. Okay. The good news is the Secretariat is always on top of things. I'm a little bit either ahead or behind.
Thank you so much to the panel. And Catherine, you will get to have your closing remarks in a second. Before that, on behalf of the el-Sheikh Technical Secretariat, Kahori Miyake, Amanda Starbuck, Carlos Lopez, Jessica Omikuti, we have Gunter Tallinger, Janine Felsen, everyone on the stage, and everyone online. And Joachim, thank you also for joining us. A big warm thank you from the Technical Secretariat. It's been an honor to work with such a dedicated group and such a diverse group. We've all learned so much during these last months. And thank you for setting the way forward for the non-state actors. You had a big task and you delivered together with Catherine. And Catherine, over to you for closing remarks.
All right, I cut off the mic already. So good news, I'm gonna keep this really short. So I wanna thank the Secretariat. We aren't always easy, I mean that by me, because I have very high expectations for what we need to deliver. But to Selwyn, for your huge leadership, and Sophie, I don't know where she is, somewhere. Oh, she's in the back of the room, but thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. To Haiti, to Lorena, Carolina disappeared, but she was with us. One point, Vanya, Hernani, if I've forgotten anyone, I really do want to thank you for all the work that you did and that you do every day. And then there's a lot of folks in this room. I forgot Mahmoud, who I think may have left. I see another one of the high-level champions, Nigel Topping, and I could go through, because I look at this room and there's a lot of friends, so I don't want to leave anyone out, because that's always really terrible. So you know who you are, you know what you did, and I really thank you for all the passion and support. And I just want to end on one note. Like, sometimes folks say, like, you know, this is hard. Sometimes my kids say that. That's usually with their homework, and I say, well, do the work. But, I mean, hard things are hard. And they're also really important, the hardest things. And so the hardest thing we have to do is tackle climate change. But it is the best thing we can do. And to those of you in the room who toil every single day, and for those of you watching online who are wondering, will leaders lead? We can do this. We can do this. And I was thinking this, I was swimming the other day, and I'd seen the Secretary General's tweets. If you don't follow him, which of course you do, his tweets are the best. But I think I'm paraphrasing, but it's something that my swim coach used to say to me. He said, winners never quit. And I guess you could have the opposite, quitters never win. We need to keep 1.5 degrees alive, but we actually just need to do the work. And we know what we need to do, we can do it, and we owe it to ourselves, but we owe it to all the folks that are counting on all of us right here and on future generations. So with that, let's just go, keep on keeping on, and I just want to thank you. I want to also say it's like peace out for me, the report's in, and now it's all over. It's over to all of you folks, and once again, thanks. Oh wait, we must get a picture. We must get a picture with the Secretary General. Oh, look, you're running for him. No, he has to come for a picture. Yeah, it's all right.
It's a pleasure to work with you.
All the way over there. Calling all the members.